All of the retired teachers know what this means. We are Story Theater, and we are very happy to be with you tonight to present our version of Vote. One of our purposes is to volunteer in the school district 281 in the Volunteers in Partnership program. We go to all the elementary schools and we try to engender in students a love for reading. So we base our scripts on books that have morals or lessons most of the time. And one of the most important lessons we have is about our democracy and about this great privilege and right that we have to vote. So tonight, Story Theater would like to present to you the program that we present to the students in our school district, Vote, by Eileen Christensen.
V-O-T-E for Chris. V-O-T-E for Chris. V-O-T-E. Yeah, we're gonna vote.
He's our man. If he can't do it, no one can. Bill Brown. He's our man. If he can't do it,
No one can.
I'm Riley. I'm a dog. And I live with Chris Smith, who's running for mayor. And I know all about voting.
I'm Sparky. I'm a dog and I live with Chris too, but I have to ask Riley to explain what's going on.
And I'm Chris Smith, candidate for mayor. I would really appreciate your vote. And this is my daughter, Angela, and these are some of my supporters. I think my mom's gonna make a great mayor.
She's honest and fair, and she'll spend your money wisely.
V-O-T-E for Chris.
no one can.
I'm Bill Brown. I'm also a candidate for mayor. I believe I have a better plan for our town. And these are some of my supporters.
Our town needs its roads repaired, and Bill Brown is the one to do it.
That's right.
Bill thinks we need a new water tower. I agree.
Bill supports a new stadium for our team.
Bill Brown. He's our man.
And if he can't do it, no one can.
We are undecided voters. We need more information before we're ready to vote.
We need to learn about Chris and Bill before we can choose the candidate we want as our mayor.
We need someone to support this school referendum.
And we need someone to keep our city clean.
And I hope they're not going to raise taxes.
Vote for Chris.
Hey! Riley, what are we doing here?
Oh, this is a rally, Sparky. We're asking for people to vote for Chris for mayor. And those folks want everyone to vote for Bill Brown instead.
Vote? What's that?
Well, voting is a way to choose. For example, when Chris and her family came to the animal shelter to choose a pet, not everybody wanted me, if you can believe that.
I can believe that.
Dad and Angela wanted me. Chris wanted a poodle. So we took a vote. Dad and Angela voted for me. Chris voted for the poodle. But I won because I got 2 votes. Poodle only got 1. That's the way it works. Let's go help Chris get people to decide to vote for her instead of Bill Brown.
Oh, that's easy.
Sparky, stop that. You can't do that. This country is a democracy. People have the right to vote for whomever they want.
What if somebody doesn't vote?
Well, it's true. Some people don't vote. They may think that their one vote doesn't count.
Well, I vote because some elections are decided by just a few votes.
And I would hate to see Chris lose by just one vote.
I vote for that reason, and because I remember that voting is a right that everyone didn't always have.
For example, when our country was founded, only white men who owned property could vote.
That doesn't sound fair.
Oh, no women.
Whoa.
It wasn't fair. People got angry and protested. They marched, had rallies, and went on hunger strikes. Some were even arrested. It took many years and 4 amendments to the Constitution to get the voting rights we have today.
That's right, Riley. Do you know that it took 80 years for African American men to get the right to vote?
Oh, no, excuse me, Angela. Did you know that Minnesota was one of the first states to give African American men the right to vote?
Yeah.
But not women.
You're right. It took 130 years for women to get the right to vote.
Times have certainly changed, haven't they? We have already elected an African-American president, Barack Obama.
And now, in our town, we have a woman running for mayor.
And just last year, one of our major political parties nominated a woman, Hillary Clinton, to run for president of the United States.
That's right.
Every year, new American history is being made by people who vote.
Wow. So who can vote now?
Sparky, everyone who's an American citizen and who's at least 18 years of age has the right to vote.
So now what? What do you have to do to be able to vote?
Well, first you have to register, which means putting your name, your address, and proof that you live there on a list of eligible voters.
Register? Well, how do I do that?
It's pretty easy. There are lots of places to do it. Rallies like this one.
Okay.
You can also register at your town offices, like City Hall, shopping malls, farmers markets, schools when they have open houses. You can even register to vote on the internet.
This is one smart kid.
Do you have to answer a lot of questions?
No, it's pretty easy. You just have to give some basic information, and you can even join a party if you'd like.
Oh, a party! Woo-hoo! Will there be doggy treats?
Oh, Sparky, sorry, it's not that kind of a party. A political party is like a club for people who share similar ideas on things like government, education, healthcare, and the environment.
Is there a party that wants to let dogs vote?
Don't be silly. The parties have names like Democrats, Republicans, the Green Party, the Libertarians, the Progressive Party, the America First Party, just to name a few. And none of them want to give dogs the vote.
I guess I won't join any party.
That will make you an independent.
Okay, I've got all that. Now, how do people decide who to vote for? I mean, it was easy to choose between you and a poodle.
Thanks.
But Bill and Chris are both nice people. I like Chris better because I know her. She feeds me.
Well, that's the key, Sparky. Voters need to learn about what the candidates will do if they're elected. That's called their platform. Listen to Chris and Bill. They're having a debate.
Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, sir.
If I am elected mayor, I promise to spend your money wisely. I am honest and trustworthy. Now, my opponent just wants to spend, and spend.
Oh, I am also reliable and trustworthy. And it's totally true. I do want to spend money on building new schools for our children. Bill Brown, He's got a spending plan.
Right?
He wants to build a new stadium for the town. Good luck.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Bill Brown, he's our man. He can't do it. No
Wow, this is confusing. I think we need more information on these candidates.
I'm sure they have more on their platforms than just a new school or a new stadium.
You're right, they both have good ideas. I'm gonna pay closer attention, and I'm gonna get my information from the news or from the TV.
Well, you know, I think they both have websites, so I'm going to go on the internet and check them out before I decide who I'm going to vote for.
And I think I know what I'm going to do. If they have another debate, I'm going to have a list of questions ready. That way I can ask all the things I need to know.
Good idea. Yeah.
Wow, so what can we do to help people to choose Chris for mayor?
Well, just look and listen to what Chris and her supporters are planning.
All right, now I do have that website, and that's good, but we have to make sure that people know exactly what I stand for. So, I've written a letter too, and I'd like it sent to every household in the city.
Okay.
Mom, we've put address labels on over 1,000 of your letters.
Oh, you are the biggest help, Angela.
Yes.
You know, we're gonna need some more money for postage, for yard signs. Let's have a fundraiser so we can have a TV ad.
That's a good idea.
Oh, thank you so much, Angela, and all of you that are working so hard. You are entirely right. We are going to need lots of money for those TV ads, for the newspaper. Oh, and don't forget the yard signs. I want yard signs all over the place. Oh, dear, are we going to get enough people to support and donate?
Oh, yes. You know, you are the best one for the job.
Thank you.
So let's get going.
All right, let's go. Okay.
Well, looks like running for office is a lot of work. Do you think Bill Brown is doing the same thing in his campaign?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
But you can't have it. You can't have it.
When people run for office, they work hard. That means lots of volunteers and lots of money.
I know. We've seen lots of political ads on TV. Some of them are not very nice. They say that Chris just wants to spend and spend. That's not true. Can they say that?
Oh, I'm afraid so. There are some misleading ads out there. That's why voters have to do their research to see which candidate really supports their views.
I can tell you one thing. I know who I'm going to vote for. I've done my research. I'm registered. Now I'm ready to vote.
I hope you're gonna vote for Chris Smith, but, you know, you don't have to tell me because voting is private. In fact, you don't have to tell anybody who you vote for unless you really want to.
Well, that's good to know because, you know, it is a private matter. But now, where do I vote?
I can show you where to vote.
Oh, okay.
We live close to each other in the neighborhood and probably vote at the same place.
You mean everybody doesn't vote at the same place?
Oh.
How does that work?
Well, usually voters are assigned to a place near where they live. And it has to be a building that's big enough to accommodate the voting machines, such as City Hall here.
Okay.
Or libraries, or churches. Well, it sounds like they make it pretty easy for people to be able to vote. That's true. But it's hard to believe that in Minnesota, half of the people who were eligible to vote did not vote in the last election.
Well, but now, when do I vote?
Well, it's always the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
go. I'm gonna be out of town that day. I'm registered, I've done my research, I know where to vote, and now I won't even be able to vote.
Oh, yes, you can.
There are several different ways that you can vote. You can vote early,
Okay.
or you can pick up an absentee ballot and just mail it in.
There's really no reason not to vote.
That sounds simple. You just go to your voting place and vote. People can vote lots of times. It's so easy.
Sparky, that's against the rules. Each eligible voter gets one vote on one ballot. Just one. That's why it's so important to make it count.
Ballot? What's a ballot?
This is a sample ballot. It has the candidates' names with a circle in front. You fill in the circle of the person you want to vote for. I filled in Chris Smith's name because she's my mom and I want her to win.
Bill Brown, he's our man. If he can't do it, no one can.
Oh, finally, election day is here. Now, all we have to do is wait and see how everybody voted.
Oh, now let's watch the results on TV. Oh, I hope we win. We've worked so hard.
I know.
Turn it to Channel 4.
Let's look and see what is happening.
And the winner is Chris Smith.
The winner is my mom!
Well, the votes are in, but it looks like Chris Smith won by only 95 out of 35,000 votes. That is really close. We want to make sure that everything's done just right.
Bill, I've been thinking. There have been times when people counting votes have made mistakes. And there have been times when voting machines have broken down. I think we ought to have a recount.
I agree. It may take a few extra days. We want to make sure everything is done just right. And who knows? I may win yet.
Yeah. You know, Bill Brown, he wants a recount.
Oh, no. A recount? That's not fair. You won.
Well, you know, it does kind of seem so, Angela, but, you know, if I were in his place, I would do the exact same thing. Oh, but waiting is really hard.
I hate waiting.
It's been 3 days since the election, and the recount is complete. Chris Smith is the winner.
My mom did win. Thank you.
Congratulations, Chris. I know you will make a fine mayor, and I will do everything I can to help you make this town and keep it a great town.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to my family, my supporters. Thank you to all of you who voted for me and all of those who didn't vote for me. I want to hear your ideas because together with Bill Brown and all of the other fine citizens of our town, we can make this a city we're proud of. Thank you.
Whoa, I'm glad that's over. Once in a lifetime is enough for me.
Oh, wait a minute, Sparky. Chris was only elected for one term. That's a limited amount of time. She has 4 years to do everything she promised to do during the election. If after that time people like what she did, she could run for another term.
Well, I guess we better enjoy being mayor dogs while we can.
What do you mean we? I'm older and wiser. I think I should be mayor dog.
I think we should vote.
So we hope with this script that we were able to give our students a lot of good information with a little bit of sugar, with the help of Sparky, to get the information across. Thank you very much for allowing us to come and present to you. I think we have to move some stuff.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Lois Wendt, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Crystal, New Hope, and East Plymouth. On behalf of our league, we welcome you to our meeting with Secretary of State Steve Simon. I'm sure Mr. Simon will have insights on voting issues in Minnesota and the United States. The League of Women Voters is widely known for its voter registration and education efforts, and is a nonpartisan political organization. We believe that every eligible American citizen should be able to cast a vote. The League believes that congressional districts and government legislative bodies should be apportioned substantially on population and apply the principle, one person, one vote. We also believe that redistricting should not dilute the effective representation of minority citizens, and that efforts that attempt or result in partisan gerrymandering should be opposed. Your membership in our league is welcomed, women and men. We have information about the league and voter registration materials at the entrance table. Please see one of our members, which there are many of you here this evening, to answer any of your questions. And I'd just like to alert you to an upcoming event by the Golden Valley League of Women Voters. On November 18th at 9:30 in the morning, they are having a forum on campaign finance. Ginny Hickman, our program chair, will now introduce Secretary of State Steve Simon.
Welcome. The League of Women Voters of the United States and League of Women Voters of Minnesota members are focusing on our roles in making democracy work. And one very important issue in a workable democracy is being aware of how state legislative and U.S. House map boundaries are determined and how this process affects our voting. The League of Women Voters of the United States redistricting position, in brief, supports redistricting processes and enforceable standards that promote fair and effective representation at all levels of government, with maximum opportunity for public participation. Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon is here to enlighten us on facts and issues, problems, solutions, and trends surrounding redistricting, gerrymandering, and court involvement in these issues. And I might say as a side that we had a little bit of communication issues defining what we wanted him to speak, but we know that he's good at giving campaign speeches, and so he can handle this. Steve Simon is the 22nd and current Secretary of State. He was elected to the position in 2014. As a member of the DFL party, he previously represented District 46B in the Minnesota House of Representatives. He has a BA in political science from Tufts University and a JD from the U of M Law School. He worked as an assistant attorney general from 1996 to 2001 and has been an associate with the law firm of Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi since 2001. Right? He's a member of the League of Women Voters, among many other civic groups. Now, I got this vitae from Wikipedia, so if it's not quite right, well, that's the way the news goes these days. Welcome, Secretary Simon.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for having me. I really, really appreciate it. I really jump at the chance to speak when I can with League of Women Voters chapters. After all, I am a member of one, in good standing, I hope. I think my dues are current. And I say that because my experience has been that this organization, nationally and on the local level, has really been at the forefront of so many issues that pertain to our democracy. And I'm particularly grateful to so many of the League chapters around Minnesota for really being active and really showing their voices, not just at the legislature, but generally in their own communities. And that's very, very important. So I really, really appreciate you all being here. I want to give a specific shout out and hello to my former legislative colleague and a person who represents, I suspect, many people in this room, and that's Lynn Carlson. I was happy to run into him in the parking lot. I wasn't sure that he'd be in here today, but I learned a lot from him just serving alongside him for 10 years. Now, 10 years may sound like a long time in the legislature, but compared to Lynn's tenure, it's nothing. You may know, but if you don't, it bears repeating, that Lynn Carlson is not only the most senior member of the Minnesota legislature, House or Senate right now, he holds the record in the history of the state of Minnesota for the most senior legislature, House or Senate. That takes... and that's not just an accident. You don't just get to be that and get that status by just sort of showing up. You get it by being what Lynn is, which is really kind of the gold standard, I would say, among legislators, at least that I served with in 10 years. He is knowledgeable, he is patient, he is hardworking, he is respected, and he is effective. And he didn't pay me to say that. That's the truth. And I learned a lot from serving with him. I had the good fortune to sit actually near him for most of my time on the floor in the legislature during my 10 years and just tried to get as much from osmosis through him about the legislative process, about when to do things, when not to do things in terms of just legislative tactics and strategy. So it's an honor for me to be here in front of Lynn Carlson, Representative Lynn Carlson. So you may know that the Secretary of State's office does many things. We have many duties and responsibilities. But the sort of flagship responsibility, the one that most people think about when or if they think of the Office of Secretary of State, has to do with elections. So we serve, in effect, as the Chief Elections Administrative Office for the state of Minnesota. Much of what happens with elections, as some of you know, happens at the local level. For example, we don't count a single ballot in our office. The counting is done at the local level. But we do other things like coordinate the voter registration system, help train the trainers when it comes to election judges, do the statewide reporting, and so on. So I like to say, by way of summary, that I'm in the democracy business. And what a time to be in the democracy business. Am I right? Today is the one-year anniversary, November 8th, of last year's presidential election. And I think it's safe to say that it's been one heck of a ride since then, right? Whether you were for Donald Trump for president or Hillary Clinton for president or someone else, I think we can all agree that the 2016 campaign was really like no other. And I say that because I keep coming back to this one word about that campaign, and the word is intensity. Now, all elections are intense. Presidential elections are even more intense. Open seat presidential elections, where there's no incumbent, where we know we're electing the next president, are especially intense. But I don't think anything prepared most of us for the degree of intensity that we saw this last election cycle. And I say that because I think it's clear, let me put this as diplomatically as I can, we had two major party nominees who inspired strong feelings. How's that? Is that diplomatic enough? Inspired strong feelings. That's a nice way of saying people had very passionate feelings about them. Passionate feelings of like and dislike. But the good news is that coming out of that, Minnesota did very, very well. And you may know this already, but again, it bears repeating that Minnesota's record when it comes to voter turnout, voter engagement, showing up is extremely good. How good? Here's how good. At one point, for 9 elections in a row, Minnesota was #1 in the country in voter turnout. Now just think about that for a second. If you heard about a statistic like that in almost any other context, if you heard about an athlete who won 9 MVP awards in a row, or if you heard about an actor or actress who won 9 Oscars in a row, you would be absolutely floored. Minnesota, at one point, 9 in a row, #1. Until a few years ago, we started to slip just a little bit. When I was elected in 2014 rather. When I was elected in 2014, we were #6 in the country. Not bad at all. If you're grading on a curve, 6 out of 50, not bad at all. Representative Carlson's a former teacher. I'm sure he would be proud to award that grade, and any of us would be proud to take that grade home to mom and dad. 6 out of 50, very solid. But not quite up to our usual high, superior Minnesota standards, right? So when I came in, I and others issued a challenge to Minnesota, which was, hey, let's try to get back to #1. We think we know what it takes. We've been there before. We haven't been there in a little bit. Let's try to get back to #1. And so we employed a lot of strategies, worked with a lot of partners, a lot of people and agencies and organizations throughout the state. And I'll skip through all the steps, but simply tell you that 1 year ago tonight, November 8th of last year, when the dust settled, guess what? We got there. Minnesota is back on top, #1 in the country in voter turnout. Give yourselves a round of applause for that. So, I wanted to address the topic of redistricting tonight because it is a hot topic. There's a Supreme Court case that I want to talk a little bit about, and then I want to engage us all in a little bit of a discussion about this or other issues that you care to talk about. But I want to sort of lay the groundwork first, and I did that a little bit by talking about our #1 status, but more particularly, kind of Minnesotans' attitudes when it comes to voting and why this redistricting issue is so important and where it fits in all of this. So I think the #1 achievement, meaning the achievement of having gotten back to #1, is important because it helps sort of describe some of what I want to talk about to set up the discussion for redistricting. Because sometimes I get asked, naturally, why is it, do you suppose, that Minnesota is, if not #1, then always at the very top of the list in voter turnout? What is it about us in Minnesota? Is it something in the water? Is it dumb luck? Is it sheer coincidence? Why are we blessed with this high voter turnout? I have a theory. It's just one guy's theory, but I think it's primarily 3 things. And the last one in particular bears on the issue of redistricting. The first thing that I think explains it is laws. That's something that Representative Carlson has a lot to do with because he's been present at the creation of many of them and supported all of them as far as I can tell. We have laid down a fabric of laws in this state over the last 40 or more years which tend to value and encourage voting. We have basically taken aside as a state that voting is a good thing and that access to voting is a necessary thing because voting is a good thing. I would say this, since we just finished the World Series, if you're an Astros fan, you're very happy. If you're a Dodgers fan, not so much, but baseball has been on our minds, so let me use a baseball analogy. As you know, in baseball, the tie goes to the runner. If a throw goes to the plate and it's exactly to the nanosecond a tie, the tie goes to the runner. The benefit of the doubt goes to the runner in the case of a tie. In Minnesota, when it comes to voting, the tie goes to the voter. Over 40-plus years, and Lynn Carlson has been on the front row to that history, when we're weighing competing values as a legislature, or anyone who served in the legislature, and we're looking at the pluses and minuses of laws, we have quite strongly sided with what is easiest for the voter, what affords the most access for everyday people to vote. Now, that means you might give up on other values, not give up on, but you might maybe diminish other values. But the clear value that we have sided with, and mostly on a bipartisan basis, I have to say, over the last 40 years, is that the tie goes to the voter. It's about access and making voting as easy and as accessible as possible. And my mission, as far as I see it, in this office, my personal mission as the current and temporary occupant of this office, is to make it as easy as possible for all eligible Minnesotans to vote, period. That's my mission. It's no more complicated than that. And that, I think, is consistent with the history that I just described. So what do I mean by that? I mean things like Election Day or same-day voter registration. Lynn Carlson was present at the creation, again, of that. We've had it since 1974. It means, as you know, and many of you know from personal experience, that unlike the vast majority of other states, about 35 4 other states. We are one of the 16 that has it. Unlike those other states, there is no pre-registration cutoff. In those other states, those other 34 states that don't have it yet to this day, if you're not registered to vote by mid-October or even early October, depending on the state, and some of you know from having lived in those other states, if you aren't registered by that cutoff time, you're done. That's it. There is no do-over. There is no get-out-of-jail-free card. There is no excuse for ignorance of the law. Maybe you didn't understand or realize that you had to register, or didn't understand or realize that you had to re-register or freshen up your registration, whether you moved across town or across the hall in an apartment building. But in Minnesota, we have that backdrop, that fail-safe, and that is that you can roll out of bed in Minnesota the day of the election, go to your polling place, register right there, and vote. And that, more than anything, I would say, over the past 40 years, has really moved the needle when it comes to democracy and participation and turnout. No question about it. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people every election in Minnesota use it. This is not some niche service designed, for a few who partake of this sort of boutique service. That's not it at all. It's very much a mass kind of phenomenon that people like, use, and enjoy and benefit from. So that's what I mean. We have things like online voter registration, which just came through in 2013, which means you don't have to go to a government office anymore. You don't have to put pen to paper anymore. You can go to a website and you can register if you wish online. You can still do it the other way and go to a government office and put pen and paper, but you don't have to. We also have no excuses absentee voting. I take some pride of ownership in that. I authored that bill my last term in the legislature in 2013, and it means you don't have to be absent anymore to vote absentee. Remember, the old days was if you wanted to vote absentee, you had to fill out an oath under penalty of perjury, swearing that you were either going to be out of town that day or you're too sick or disabled to show up to the polling place. But there was a lot of so-called white lying going on anyway. It didn't make much sense to make lawbreakers out of moms and dads all over the place and everyone else who was just trying to do the right thing and vote. So we decided to get rid of the excuse, as some other states have done, and many more have since, and Minnesotans have taken to it in huge, huge numbers. And it means that you can order the absentee ballot for any reason or no reason at all. You can show up in person at a government office or have it mailed to you at your home with days or even weeks to vote in advance. My dad is 84 years old. He's got Parkinson's. He doesn't drive a car anymore. He uses a walker. And in 2014, the first year it was offered, he used no excuses absentee voting, even though he was very much in town, even though he could have gone to a polling place. And he used it, and he loved the freedom and flexibility that it gave him. He even claims that he voted for me. I'll never know, right? It's a secret ballot, but he says he did. But the point is, it's not just for 84-year-old guys with Parkinson's, it's for everyone. And I'm really proud of that, and it's something that people have taken to, as I say, in droves. So that's what I mean by laws. So that's explanation number one. We have great laws on the books that Lynn Carlson, Representative Mike Freiberg is here. Please say hello to him. Some of you know him. I served with him as well in the legislature. And you owe them the thanks for putting these laws on the books and keeping them in the face of some assaults in recent years by those who would like to either undo them or radically change them. So laws is one explanation. I'm getting to gerrymandering, I promise. Number two is culture. And I'll just be real quick on this point. Culture is one of those loaded terms I certainly understand. I sort of liken the word culture to those ink blot Rorschach tests. You put the blotch of ink on the page, one person sees a giraffe, another person sees an airplane. You get the idea. It's subject to interpretation. Here's what I mean by the word culture in this context. I mean a habit or a way of doing things. And our habit or way of doing things in Minnesota when it comes to voting is unmistakable. We are doers, we are joiners, we are voters in Minnesota. It's something I think that is taught here. It's something that is encouraged. It is something that isn't mocked or dismissed. We know and we believe that voting and elections are consequential, that people get elected to stuff up and down the ballot from President of the United States on down, and that stuff matters, and the people who do that stuff matters. And we think that's a good thing. We teach it to kids, and we live it, and we just demonstrate those values. So that's part of it, too. But then the third thing, and this is where I think the gerrymandering debate really gets important. The third thing that I think, in my opinion, accounts for our high level of participation year in and year out has to do with fundamental confidence in our voting system. Confidence in our voting system in Minnesota. Confidence in the rules, those who employ them, those who enforce them. People, I think, know that it's a strong and fair system, that it's clean, it's fair, it's ethical, it's well-run. You know, I have the great privilege of traveling all around the state of Minnesota. I make it a point to get to all 87 counties every year, and I ask people that open-ended question, and not just friendly audiences or the sort of the usual suspects. And people do have a fundamental confidence in the system, by and large. There are a few speed bumps once in a while. You may know that after a year ago tonight, then President-elect Trump alleged and continues to allege that 3 to 5 million people in this country voted illegally. That is, and I have to in this job be measured and nonpartisan about these things, but I also have to call out truth and untruth when I see it, and I have to tell you that that is a reckless and irresponsible claim. Even if you believe that the president exaggerates from time to time. Let's say you think it's not 5 million, it's really closer to 3 million. Minnesota's pro rata share, that is to say our share based on population of 3 million people voting illegally, is north of 50,000 people. So the legislators in the room know, but all of you know, if we had anything close to that, if we had 5,000 people, let alone 50,000 people, that would be call for an immediate special session, a panic among elections administrators, maybe National Guard troops at the polling place, I don't know, but drastic measures. That has never happened, it isn't happening now, and it will never happen in Minnesota. You know how many convictions we have so far? 1 year ago tonight was the election. You know how many convictions, and all this is reported to our office, out of nearly 3 million voters. You know how many convictions in the state of Minnesota for any irregularity whatsoever connected to the election? 5. So if I told any of you, whether it's your occupation or a hobby or any other pursuit, whether you're you like to go fishing, or you're an attorney, or you're an Uber driver, or you're a steel worker, or whatever it is you like to do, or what you do for work, if I told you that your rate of error would be that fraction, 5 over 3 million, that would be your rate of error in your given pursuit, profession, hobby, you'd say, where do I sign up? That's near perfection. And yet, this drumbeat persists about fraud and other irregularities when there's no evidence to back it up. So there are speed bumps like that. There are speed bumps, too, about things like technological vulnerabilities. I learned about 8 weeks ago that Minnesota was one of the 21 states that was targeted by elements that were linked to the Russian government. I got the briefing myself from the Department of Homeland Security. The good news is we were not hacked. We weren't even the subject of an attempted hack. But what did happen, and the analogy I like to use and that the Department of Homeland Security said they kind of liked, is that picture a car thief casing a parking lot. The car thief is kind of walking around at night. Maybe he's taking out some binoculars. Maybe he's sort of taking a good look at traffic patterns to determine whether there's a weakness or some way to get in. But in the end, for whatever reason, the car thief decides not to go into the parking lot. We don't know why, but he doesn't go in. That's what happened to us. Someone affiliated with or working, and their exact words at the Department of Homeland Security was somebody working, quote, this was their exact quote, at the behest of the Russian government, end quote. That person cased our parking lot, scanned our website and other systems, but did not go in, did not even attempt to go in. And that's a good thing, and I'm not going to talk about why I think that was. That's not the subject of this talk. I mention it, though, in order to talk about the confidence we have in our system, because the fundamental design of our system is sound. So, starting with the fact that we have paper ballots in Minnesota, right? We're old school and proud of it. We still fill an oval out on a piece of paper. It's hard to hack paper, right? So that's pretty safe. And yes, you do put that piece of paper into an electronic voting machine, and all of you know that from yesterday if you voted in your community. You put it into a machine, but that machine under state law, thanks to these guys, cannot, shall not, must not be connected to the internet at any time. And then we have encrypted systems that communicate with our office, and on and on and on. But the system, the fundamental design is very good. So I think confidence, voter confidence, forget partisanship or ideology, just people who think the thing is run well. You know that we have 32,000 election judges, 32,000 by the way. Anyone in here ever been an election judge, ever? Raise your hand. A lot of people I would suspect. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I always thank past or present election judges. We couldn't do it without you. It takes an army, 32,000 election judges to run an election in this state. And election judges, as you know, don't do it for their health and don't do it to get rich. They do it for other reasons, nobler reasons, and we thank you. I thank you for it. But the point is people have confidence. But once in a while, an issue comes along that either does or threatens to erode confidence in the system. Not in the players of the system or not in this party or that, but just the system, how it's run, how it's designed. And that's what I wanted to tee up for you today, because the topic that I know you want to hear about and talk about is redistricting. Now, I keep coming back to Representative Carlson. Given his longevity, he's been through several redistrictings. And many of you know redistricting is simply the once-a-decade process by which apportionment happens. And you simply take the population, divide it by the number of seats, and you get sort of a magic number that has to be in every district. And there's some wiggle room of 2 or 3 or 4% or so. And then you have to design districts that have roughly the same population. But it's not just that. Over the years in the courts and elsewhere, a set of informal and sometimes formal criteria have emerged. You can't do certain things. You can't, at least intentionally, and you arguably can't even in effect, design districts that disenfranchise or dilute the power of minority communities, for example. You can't go out of your way to separate so-called communities of interest. And if you can tell me what that means, thank you, because I think people have been wrangling over that for a long, long time. But it basically means, to give maybe an absurd example just for the sake of argument, is, you can't take the city of Minneapolis and if Minnesota has, which it does now, 8 congressional districts, somehow have Minneapolis in like 5 different congressional districts. You could get away with 2 maybe, but 3 starts to look fishy, 4 is ridiculous, 5 is sort of downright unlawful. So another principle, this one is less formal, has to do with competitiveness, that they should be, all things being equal, and they're not, almost ever, but if all things were equal, you want to make them as competitive as you reasonably can. And so the idea of redistricting is to have fair districts that are designed fairly based on population, that's a given, designed fairly based on minority and other community representation, designed to be as competitive as is practical. And the reason I say that is some of these criteria are in tension with one another. So you might design a district which is super competitive but dilutes African American strength. Or you might have one that is strongly, as a strong component of African Americans in it, but because of that isn't very competitive. It favors one political party overwhelmingly over another. So these things are in tension. There's no such thing, as the legislators in the room know, as a perfect district that meets all the criteria and that is absolutely perfect. You got to give some, you got to get some. But there are 2 things I just wanted to highlight, and then we can open it up for a discussion. One has to do with the pending Supreme Court case, the Gill case, which the Supreme Court is poised to decide this term. Now, there have been cases in the past, even in the recent past. You may have heard about Texas and North Carolina and other states recently in the last 2, 3, or 4 years where the Supreme Court or other federal courts have upended or overturned certain schemes because they adversely impacted a minority community or because they messed up communities of interest or other reasons. But now I can't say the first time, that's not true, but for the first time in modern history where the issue has really been teed up purely and clearly, the Supreme Court's now going to decide an issue that it hasn't squarely addressed before in the Gill case is this opportunity, which is, okay, we know you can't discriminate against certain communities, racial, ethnic, and others. We know that you can't, arbitrarily interfere with communities of interest. We know that there are other criteria that you have to respect. But the courts never had to answer the question, what about a district that is just sort of obviously or nakedly designed for partisan purposes to advantage a particular party? Is that unconstitutional? You may think it's a bad idea, but not all bad ideas are unconstitutional. Plenty of things are legal to do. You may think they're bad ideas, but does the Constitution forbid that? And if so, to what extent? I mean, the people designing the districts are elected officials, and they have party affiliations in almost all cases. And whether consciously or subconsciously, they might be sort of putting their thumb on the scale. So can you really say that to no extent can there be any partisan leaning for a district? That seems almost mathematically impossible. certainly without impinging upon these other issues. Like you could have a bunch of districts in a given jurisdiction, say the state of Minnesota, that are divided equally on a bipartisan basis between Democratic strength and Republican strength. But then you might have really weird-looking maps that are, a bunch of starfish stacked together, or just really odd, non-contiguous, or if contiguous, strangely drawn districts that meander in and out of lines and that have strange shapes and that cut up cities like Minneapolis or New Hope or Crystal or whatever into a bunch of parts just to achieve that balance of partisanship. Or you may have those same oddly shaped districts that have the effect, if not intention, of diluting the strength of certain communities, African-American community, maybe the Hmong community in certain parts of our state, maybe Native American communities and others, and we know that's impermissible. But what about just sheer partisanship? What's the court going to decide? I don't know what the court's going to decide, but it's a fascinating issue, and most people seem to think that it's going to be a 5-4 decision no matter what. That once again there will be one or two justices, probably Justice Kennedy, as he often is, who will be the swing vote and decide whether this is constitutionally impermissible and to what extent. And that's a tough issue for any court to decide. But married to that issue of what the map looks like in the end is the other fundamental issue that I think that case, it's a question that this case begs, that it brings to all of us, which is, what if you back up a couple of steps? What if you never get to the partisanship piece? What if you never get to legislators with partisan designations allegedly designing districts that overly favor or unnecessarily favor or too blatantly favor their own political party? What if you back up a couple of steps and change the process a bit so that is essentially somewhat moot? And here's what I mean, and I'll declare my own bias. And I'd be interested, without putting them on the spot, in what the legislators here think, particularly, no offense, Representative Freiberg, but as a veteran of 4 or 5 redistrictings, I think Representative Carlson has a really unique perspective on this. But what I have supported, and I'll just be clear about my viewpoint, what seems to make sense to me are some of the proposals that would limit, not eliminate, I don't favor that, but limit some partisan legislative involvement. And the bumper sticker slogan, which I find compelling, is that ideally you want voters to choose their elected officials, not the other way around. And the system we have right now is that elected officials, in essence, choose their voters. It's state legislators that draw the lines, not only for themselves and their colleagues, but for members of Congress as well. So Representative Freiberg, Representative Carlson, after the next census, which will take place in 2020, when the dust settled and the results are in 2021, the legislature that's elected in 2020 and that takes office in 2021 will be the map makers. So in 2 elections, not 18, but in 20, we, all of us, we will be electing the map makers in Minnesota. And I hope and expect that these 2 will be among the map makers. So that is a delicate process. But I think the question is whether, because of its potential for abuse, I'm not going to say anything about whether I think it has been abused in Minnesota. I think Minnesota has been far better than most states. But in other states, I think it's fair to say that both parties have, from time to time, abused that process. And so what seems to make sense to me, and what I at least have embraced as a way forward for us, is something that started out, it wasn't my idea, several years ago. A number of Minnesota sort of statespeople, including Walter Mondale, former Governor Al Quie, former Governor Arnie Carlson, Roger Moe, the former Senate Majority Leader in the Minnesota Senate, and others, came together around a proposal that in some form or another has been around the legislature since then. I want to say 7 or 8 years. And I used to carry this legislation a couple times. And in principle, here's what it says. It would say, and this is based on what other states have already done, states like Iowa, California, Arizona, and others. And it seems to be a mini trend. And the idea would be to create, the idea would be this. The legislature would still maintain ultimate authority. Here's how it would work. The Democrats in the legislature would appoint 3 retired judges to a panel. The Republicans in the legislature would get together and they would appoint 3 retired judges. Those 6 retired judges would lock themselves in a room. Well, doesn't say lock, but they would get in a room, and the 6 of them would then choose a 7th retired judge. And those 7 judges would be the initial map makers. And they would have access to the same information that the legislature does, our office and the Office of Secretary of State, we have a role, a small one, but we have a role in the redistricting process as well, working with GIS and the map-making people and the census and the state demographer, and they'd be entitled to all that information, all that staff, all that software, all that programming, all that expertise, and they would draw the maps for the legislature and for the congressional districts, subject to legislative approval, but it's only an up and down vote. So Representative Carlson, Representative Freiberg, their colleagues could not amend it and say, we love the map except for district so-and-so, or we love the curve of that bend on district such and such, except we want to make it straighter, or we want to, that's it. It's either yes or no, up or down, take it or leave it. Up or down vote. If it's no, it goes back to those 7 people in a room to do a second version. They vote again. If it goes no a second time, then and only then does the legislature get to draw the map. Now, in some states, it's more limited or more severe, I should say. In some states, like in Arizona, for example, and this was litigated all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court a term or two ago, the legislature is totally out of it. They've created a commission, and the commission has total and ultimate supreme authority because the legislature has delegated it to them. I'm not suggesting that. I think the legislature can be a backstop and maybe curb any excesses by potentially voting no. So I think that's okay. But I think it would have the advantage, a couple advantages. One is the one that I've kind of been alluding to, which is it would avoid the possibility or minimize the possibility that elected officials are choosing their voters. When I was in the legislature, I could tell you exactly the district that I wanted. You know, I'd love to give my district a nip or a tuck, or, you know, I'd love to shed a pesky precinct over here that maybe didn't vote as much for me, and I'd love to take on that neighboring precinct that my seatmate might have, and I'd love that precinct. That's a great vote-rich precinct for me. I could pretty clearly design the district I would love to have. I had a great district, by the way, but you know what I'm talking about. So I think it would have that advantage. But then there's another more practical advantage. And when I talk to some of the former legislative leaders who support this, like Roger Moe, who many of you know, who was the longtime Senate Majority Leader, like Steve Swigum, who was the longtime former Speaker of the House. Roger Moe is a Democrat, Steve Swigum is a Republican, and they both are foursquare behind this piece of legislation, and that's the second issue. The second issue is legislative resources. To hear them tell it, and maybe Representative Carlson will have a different narrative on this, but when I talk to them about why they support this, they say, look, every 10 years, and each party suffers from this, has this fantasy that they're going to run the table in the year ending 0, in the election in the year ending 0, when you elect the map makers. They're going to run the table. It's going to be glorious, right? Our team, our red shirts or our blue team, this is great. We don't want any reform because we could run the table, man. I mean, we could design the whole thing. What if we have the House, Senate, and the governor? I mean, it's going to be great. A, it never happens, and B, on the way to it never happening, it costs so much in terms of time and energy and exasperation and money. And it always, always, always ends up in the courts. And even when the legislature passes something, the courts end up modifying it. There are outside parties with standing who end up suing, whether it's a civil rights group or what have you, whether it's on the left side of the spectrum or the right side of the spectrum. So this fantasy that both sides suffer from, which is this is going to be great. Why should we change anything? I mean, we could really get lucky in the year ending 0, and we could control the map-making process. It doesn't happen, and there's just so much exasperation, and it grinds people up in the legislature. It certainly can. There's bad will among colleagues, even colleagues within the party, even when parties have control of the legislature, as happened last time. For example, Mark Dayton was governor, but the Republicans at that time in 2011 and 2012 had control of the House and Senate. There were hard feelings and walkouts and grudges just among the Republicans because some of them were aced out. You know, there was a Republican running against another Republican, and allegations of unfairness and conspiracies, and who was in with the speaker or not in with the speaker was punished, and all this stuff. So when you hear Swigum and Moe talk about it, they say, yes, we're for it for that other reason, that it's probably not right for legislators to have as direct a voice as they do right now in picking their own voters. But there's also this other thing. We're trying to get stuff done, and redistricting slows things down, and it creates bad feelings, and at the end of the day, it isn't even the final say anyway, because there's always litigation and it ends up in the courts. So I just wanted to leave you with that as two things to watch. One is this Gill decision, which will be decided by June. That's mandated, about whether partisanship is in itself, just like racial animus or even unintentional racial impact, is it on the same level? Is partisanship, is a district designed with the intention of favoring a Democrat or putting a thumb on the scale for the Republican, is that the same as, should it enjoy the same constitutional level of scrutiny as, say, the same thing based on race? So that's the question they're deciding. But then taking a couple steps back, the other thing that I would just offer for your consideration is, should Minnesota at some point adopt some sort of Arizona-like, Iowa-like, California-like commission, whether it's the kind that I described or another, that would sort of help put a buffer between the legislature and just designing its own districts or the districts of members of Congress. So it's an interesting issue. It's not going away. In fact, it's going to accelerate as we get closer and closer and closer to the year ending 0, which is the year every cycle when we elect the map makers, and then the year ending 1, where we actually start drawing the maps. These two gentlemen, I hope and expect, will be part of that process, or at least in the legislature when that process is going on. And Representative Carlson has been around it for a long, long time and has thrived and survived amidst many different changes in the shape and form of his district. And so it's an interesting issue, one that I think does speak to that level of confidence in our elections. We don't want people thinking, this last president, I'll just end where I started, which is this was an intense presidential election. But one of the things that contributed to the intensity, and certainly the interest in that election, was a word that was used by candidates on both sides of the political spectrum. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders used the word rigged a lot, that the system was rigged, the economy was rigged, our democracy is rigged. And my fear when it comes to redistricting, and I think the League of Women Voters generally has this same fear, whether or not they support all these same solutions or will, I'm not sure. The fear is that this redistricting issue is one thing that could similarly, over time, if not in the short term, erode confidence and lend itself to some people claiming that by virtue of legislators drawing their own districts and others, that the system tends to look more rather than less rigged. So I leave you with that thought. There are plenty of opportunities and avenues for reform, and I will emphasize, as I always do, good, thoughtful, decent people can disagree on these issues. There's no one right way to think about these. I've shared what I think about them, but others who are smart, thoughtful, experienced may have a different view, and I hope we can tease out some of that tonight. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Do we have time for a discussion, a few questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask about the census. There's talk about not using the same people to go out and take census, cutting back on it. And what about counting the homeless?
Right.
And the reservations and so on. Do you think that that's going to be as predictable as a measure as it was in the past?
Great question. I'll repeat the question in case everyone didn't hear it. The question was about the census itself, the tactics, the practices of the census. There's been some talk that it might be a little less lax or looser or not as well funded this time. And we want to count people. And that takes people, it takes resources, it takes census takers, it just takes a lot of moving parts. So I have heard some of the same fears expressed. We're still, 3 years away from that, probably a little less, more like 2.5. And I've heard some things that make me a little bit nervous about whether that will be adequately or fully funded. We do need to count everyone who's out there, and that takes a lot of resources to find people. You can't just, not everyone just sort of shows up and participates. It takes some nudging. It takes some pushing. And that's very, very important. And the stakes for Minnesota are pretty high. Some of you may know that since the early 1960s, Minnesota has had 8 congressional districts. We used to have 9. But as of 1961 or 1962, we went down to 8, and there it has remained since then. In the last census, Minnesota was only 15,000 people, which is nothing. That's a drop away from. We were 15,000 people on the right side of the line for keeping our 8th congressional district. We will be probably, whether we're on whichever side of the line we are, it's going to be probably even less than 15,000 next time. The smart money, if you ask the state demographer, she thinks that we're more likely to lose it than keep it. And so counting people, making sure every person is counted, but no more than every person, obviously. We want to count every person, but no more, is very crucial for Minnesota because, having 7 members of Congress versus 8 is an important thing. It's another voice in Washington, D.C. So it's terribly important anytime, but particularly this next time, that we count everyone. So I have some of those worries based on some things I've heard. Interestingly, that the census is done through the Commerce Department of the U.S. government, and it seems unsettled right now, is what I know of it. Yes?
This bill case in front of us, excuse me. Isn't it true that the Constitution itself does not mention parties? So
That's right.
what grounds would there be, do you suppose, to make this decision?
So the grounds, that's a great point. The Constitution says nothing about political parties whatsoever. Partisanship is not a factor or wasn't a factor in the drafting of the Constitution. The idea, though, is that you go back to first principles, namely one person, one vote. And that's a principle enshrined in the Constitution, not in those words, but that's the sort of the principle that's been enunciated over the years. So the hook here for the plaintiffs in the case is to say that you violate one person, one vote, or you impinge upon that right if some class of persons is intentionally discriminated against, even if that class is not a class mentioned in the Constitution. That's the legal argument. That's the legal argument. But you make a very good point. It's not like other matters in the Constitution, either the original Constitution or the amendments, that mentions political parties. It's not in there. Which maybe means it's an uphill battle to overturn the Wisconsin.
One person, one vote thing came quite strongly after this last election, too, in the sense that the Electoral College is tilted in such a way that your populous states don't get a one-person, one vote as far as the Electoral College, because it's like all the people in Wyoming are half the people in, not even half the people in New York City or Los Angeles or something like that, and they get 3 electoral votes. Do you see any prospect that there's been some talk, or, you know, you probably, this is beyond your pay grade, I think, but of the Electoral College being modified in some way?
Okay, stand back. I have a strong feeling on this one, and I will try not to monopolize here, but I'll try to summarize it quickly. So I strongly support something called the National Popular Vote Initiative. So let's take a step back for a second. So, and it bears, and most of you know this, but it probably bears repeating just so we're operating from the same set of facts. So the Constitution talks about this thing called the Electoral College, right? We know that every state gets them. We know it's a portion on population, right? We know that that's how we elect the president, not by popular vote, but by this thing we call Electoral College, and these people called electors. And we know how they're divided and all of that. But the Constitution is silent, totally silent, on how those electoral votes are allocated. It just so happens by tradition, but nothing more. Just habit, just tradition. 48 out of the 50 states have made the conscious decision to do it on a winner-take-all basis, meaning if you win Minnesota by 1 vote, you get all the marbles. You get all 10 electoral votes. That's the way it's just evolved over time, but nothing compels that. Constitution's silent. If Minnesota or any state wanted to award its electoral votes based on the tallest candidate, all 10 of our electoral votes are going to go to the tallest candidate for president. Or if we wanted to say we want to award all of our 10 electoral votes on the candidate with the most letters in his or her last name. Now that's absurd, of course, but it's permissible. The Constitution just says, states, we're going to have this thing called electoral votes. You get to decide, because it's silent, you get to decide how to award them. It just so happens by tradition, by choice. 48 have said we're doing it this way. 2 do it by congressional district, Maine and Nebraska. But 48 have said we're doing it this way. But nothing, the Constitution gives us total discretion about how we want to award them. And I think we ought to do what this movement is suggesting, which is band together with a sufficient number of other states. We wouldn't do this on our own. We would all hold hands and jump off the ledge together, which is if sufficient number of states band together, you can agree to award your electoral votes by state on the basis of who won the national popular vote. So that even if someone, quote, won Minnesota, which could mean 1 vote, it could mean 1 million votes, whatever, we agree that whoever won the whole thing gets our 10. Now, that's an agreement we can do. There's nothing stopping us. The Constitution says we can do it on any of those absurd bases. The reason I think we should do that, which is not amending the Constitution, it's keeping that stuff there, It's just saying we're choosing to do it in a different way, which the Constitution already imagined. And let me just tell you a story, because sometimes I think the suspicion is that, well, you're a Democrat, you're just avenging either the loss of Hillary Clinton, who won more popular votes, or the loss of Al Gore, who won more popular votes. So that's really what you're about. But let me just tell you a personal story, just to give you a sense, I hope, I hope I have some credibility on this. In 1992, I moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, to work on the Clinton-Gore campaign at the national headquarters. And when I got there in the first week in June, Bill Clinton, my candidate, was in third place. Third place. Ross Perot was in first place, according to all the polls. George H.W. Bush, the incumbent president, was in second place. And little old, semi-known Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton was in third place. And I remember having lunch in downtown Little Rock at a campaign hangout, a restaurant called Your Mama's. Yes. It's really called that. And it's exactly what you think it is. It was sort of down-home Southern cooking. It was called Your Mama's restaurant. So we would have lunch at Your Mama's. And a new poll had come out, and there was some of the pundits were talking, and they were saying, hey, you know, Bill Clinton could still be elected president even if he gets the third, not the second place. He could be third in the popular vote and be elected president. Why? Because in a three-way race, it's possible that no one will get to 270 electoral votes. And what happens when no one gets to 270? The House, the U.S. House, decides it. And guess who controlled the U.S. House in 1992? Strongly, the Democratic Party. So the thought was that Bill Clinton, not just second place, like Donald Trump and like George W. Bush did, you could be third place, and our guy could still win. And there were some people high-fiving it in the Your Mama's restaurant. And I remember at the time being appalled by that. Now, I'm not trying to put myself on a pedestal like I'm more virtuous or anything like that. I'm just saying I really was. My reaction was, I don't want to win that way. That's BS. In this country, the most powerful person in the face of the earth should be elected because he or she is the top vote getter, just like we do for county commissioner, state representative, anything else. And I have a tough time figuring out how we explain to that 11-year-old Afghani girl or 8-year-old Iraqi boy, where we've dispatched, you know, our blood and treasure to try to spread democracy. We explain to them, you know, elections are a good thing. But you see, sometimes, in some cases, it's the second place person who wins, not the first. I just don't understand how you explain. I understand the historical roots of why we had this, but one way to do it without amending the Constitution is just simply say, to agree, to pass legislation saying, we're going to stop that. We just cannot keep having presidents of the United States, and I don't care who it is. That's why I told you that story, is that I didn't want my candidate to win that way, and I don't think it's a healthy thing to have the second place vote getter be president of the United States, the most powerful person in the world. So this is one solution to that, and I've gone way over and talked about this for too long, but I feel strongly about it. And since you asked, yeah.
Author of the bill.
Yes, Representative Freiberg is author of the bill. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes.
I have a question about the redistricting bipartisan judges.
Mm-hmm.
The league has supported something like that, but my only question is, do you have any ideas to make that more diverse, as most of those retired judges will be white?
Yeah, I mean, the question was implicit support for the idea of a commission, but how do you make it more diverse? Since right now, if you took the pool of retired judges at this point, not current judges, but maybe the retired ones who were initially on the benches in the 60s or 70s or 80s, they're probably going to be whiter and more male than average. How do you make it more diverse? I think that's up to the legislators in the room here to just write something in the law. You could say that one of the principles in determining who the judges are or the panelists are, they don't have to be judges. I mean, retired judges is one way to do it. You could just say they appoint anyone they want. You could write that in there. You could put the guardrails in there and say these decisions must be made with respect to or with an eye towards that. I mean, you could phrase it in a number of ways, but you could do that. You could just write in what you want. That's a good point. Any other thoughts? Not just questions, but if you have comments, pushback, feedback.
Would that commission
Yes.
require constitutional change or amendment or just a law?
Just a law. Just a law. Any? Yes.
I was kind of sobered when I read that the state of Minnesota has about 3,000 flags per day on its website. And I'm sure a number of them are through your website. So I'm I'm very impressed by how technology, the internet, computers, and all of these things figure into everything we do these days. So I've also read that there is a certain professor down in, I don't know if it's Arkansas, who specializes in doing the gerrymandering kind
Oh.
of redistricting.
Mhm.
So how do you avoid that kind of thing when you have like a retired judge or something? These people, they're smart, but they, they're really not tuned into all of this, probably.
Well, my response to that would be, it's the same thing with legislators who rely heavily on staff, for example. Maybe this gentleman from Arkansas or wherever he's from, or others who can come on in and lend their expertise and whatever. Legislators, too, have to be sort of jacks of all trades, Jills of all trades, and they have to know a lot about a lot and have to rely, whether it's on House internally in the staff or outside consultants that come in. So I'm not as worried about that, because legislators have shown themselves, and I would imagine these commission members would show themselves willing to accept outside expertise, advice, et cetera, especially on the sort of computer-driven map making.
I should have said one thing there that I didn't, that he's kind of known as a bad actor.
Oh, okay. Well, but I guess the mirror image of that is that I'm sure there are non-bad actors, people who just have expertise in this area. One thing I'll note about redistricting, which I found fascinating, because I was around for the one starting in 2011 and 2012, and I remember doing some reading about it, which is, and Representative Carlson probably has the historical perspective on this, but redistricting has actually gotten cheaper, less expensive. The software has made it a lot less expensive. I remember looking at the numbers and the budgets for elections, and even forget inflation adjusted, in 1971 versus 1981 versus 1991 versus 2001, as we were preparing for 2011 and 2012, and it keeps going down, 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 down. You don't need as much staff because you've got great computer programs. It's not just all on autopilot where some robots running it, but it's gotten cheaper as you can do things that are now web-based. Now it's not just the software; it's web-based, and so that's the good news here. Is technology has made the process in many ways less cumbersome and definitely less expensive. It's really fascinating. That was the first thing that really hit me, and that I remember the folks giving us the briefing said, look at this chart. It's getting cheaper to do, not more expensive, which is good. Yes?
Could I ask, has online voting increased? How's that working?
Well, so, yeah, I have to be careful. So we don't have online voting, and I don't think we will for, a long, 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 long time. We're not ready for that. But online voter registration has been a huge success, especially because of the involvement of some outside groups. Let me give you some statistics on that. So going into the 2016 big presidential election year, the one-day record for online voter registration in Minnesota was 6,400. So we wanted to increase that in our office. And I won't go through all the details, but we worked with some national groups having to do with National Voter Registration Day and whatever. And in one day in September of 2016, we were real proud of ourselves when we kicked that 6,400 number up to about 24,000 in a day that registered. And we were proud and still are proud of that fact. However, then an outside group that you may have heard of called Facebook got involved. And Facebook decided, as part of its sort of civic education efforts, to put out a notification to its hundreds and hundreds of millions of users, really billions all over the world, but in this country, hundreds of millions of users, and put out a notification based on the state where you lived, basically just pinging its members, putting out a notification saying, hey, click on here if you want to know where to register to vote. And the link in Minnesota was to our office. In a single day, in a single 24-hour period. Now, I wish I could claim credit. I take zero credit for this. It was Facebook doing this in all 50 states. In Minnesota, in a single day, we had almost 70,000, 70,000. 6,400 at the beginning of the year. We bumped it up to 24 and change. Facebook, with one post, with one notification, in one 24-hour period, which they did simultaneously to all 50 states. That shows you something about the power of social media, and Facebook in particular. Almost 70,000 in a day in Minnesota. So that just could never happen in the days of college kids with clipboards, right? Going around at street corners. You just couldn't get that kind of critical mass, certainly not in a one-day period. But that's the real power here, which is good. Yes?
Was there any misinformation on Facebook that affected your office at all?
That's a good question. Obviously a very hot topic right now with the revelations that there were Russian-inspired or Russian-purchased and designed fake posts on Facebook. I can't say that there's any that I know of that affected our office, since we weren't about and are never about, which candidate to vote for or who's better or who's worse. We're about the process issues. So no, there was no sort of sabotage or false information put out there like, don't forget to vote Wednesday or anything like that. There was nothing like that that I know of. But we're uncovering new things all the time. We'll see. Yes?
What about the states that vote by mail? Oregon?
Yep, that's right. So there are 2.5 really, Oregon, Washington, and mostly Colorado, but Oregon and Washington on a pure basis that only vote by mail. They have abolished polling places. No more election judges, no more polling places, no more anything. Just mail. Everyone gets mailed a ballot, who's on the list, who's registered, obviously, and then they can drop it off either in person somewhere or at vote centers or in big bins that you see around the state. And that's been successful for them. I don't sense an appetite in this state, certainly among legislators, to go mandatory all mail. I think with no excuses absentee voting, we have a really nice hybrid system. Technically speaking, if voters choose that option, we could technically be an all mail state. What I'm saying is, of the 3 to 4 million registered voters we have in any particular election year, if each and every one of them decided that they wanted to utilize no excuses absentee voting, have the ballot mailed to them, and then mail it back, like my dad did in 2014 and 2016, then we would, I guess, voluntarily become a mail-only state, but it's not mandatory. Some people, I'm one of them, I'm kind of a traditionalist. I like going to the polling place. I went yesterday, I brought my 4-year-old daughter. It's kind of a fun thing. But it is important to have those options. So I wouldn't presently favor going only and exclusively and mandatorily to mail, especially when we, in essence, have that option for those who like that now. But for those who want bricks and mortar in a real polling place, you got that too. Yes?
In 2016, we let people vote early, absentee ballots. So they had to fill out the forms and they had to put it in the other envelope and the other envelope. And it was really a pain for our clerks. Are you any thoughts to going to absentee vote or voting early? Just stick it in the machine?
Yes, so we had an experiment this last election in 2016, where we allowed counties to choose whether they wanted to go for the 7 days before the election, only 7 days, not a month, not 2 weeks, but just 1 week, 7 days, where you would have an envelope-free process, where it would be very much like early voting, where you go in, you show up at, say, a city hall, and you vote, and instead of putting an envelope, instead of putting your ballot inside an envelope, and that envelope inside of a security envelope, and then handing that to someone, no envelopes. Somebody who goes in for that 7-day period, fills out their ballot, and just like game day, just like election day, they themselves can feed it, just like many of you did yesterday, feed it right into that machine. That worked out really well. Not every county chose to do it, but most did, and certainly the biggest ones did. So a large proportion of Minnesotans had that, which means that in essence, there was very little separating true early voting from what we had in 2016, at least for the 1 week period. And there's bipartisan support to grow that period to more than 1 week. And the reason that's important is most people who vote absentee, as you might imagine, it's human nature, vote in that last few days. It's fascinating. Every election cycle, and we generate these statistics and these graphs and charts, if you look at the rate or the level or the raw number of people who vote absentee, we have a 46-day absentee ballot period. So over here, it'll start like this, go like this, and let's say this is election day, and then it just shoots up. The vast majority of people who vote absentee vote in the last, I'm giving you a rough average here, but last maybe 4 or 5 days before the election. Vast majority. It just totally spikes in those last few days, and you can understand why. People maybe want to wait and watch that last debate and check out those last ads and do their own research, and so the vast proportion do it at the end, which is why that 1 week period, that final week, is an important period to have the no envelope, no fuss, no muss for the people who come in and vote in person absentee. Representative? Oh, good. Yeah, good. I think people who do it really like it. It's just less hassle for people. So, Anything else? Yeah, I'll take one more. Go ahead. Well, I can't speak to the Florida situation, but you may know that recently courts invalidated a North Carolina system where there was blatant intentional, again, not accidental or incidental or subconscious, but intentional, knowing, purposeful line drawing in order to exclude African American populations. In fact, a warning to the legislators in the room, and they found out the hard way. So in most states, and Minnesota is one of them, legislators are shielded from data practices laws. The emails they send and receive are not subject to, the public can't just request them. But that changes when there's litigation. And so it was the same in North Carolina, but once a lawsuit was in place, the court said, yeah, you get to see that stuff. And lo and behold, the litigants in the case uncovered emails between and among legislators which would make your toes curl. Blatantly talking, stupidly too, putting it on paper. If you're going to do it, right, don't be dumb enough to put it in an email, even if your state's data laws shield you from public inspection. Well, once there's a lawsuit in place, all bets are off, so they can get all of your emails. And they looked at the emails among North Carolina legislators, and it was just blatant. I mean, you can read about it, you can Google this, blatant about like, yeah, let's not have African Americans here, and let's have them here, or let's pack them all in this one district. I mean, it was just a slam dunk case. So I don't know about Florida, but what you're describing is something that has been playing out in the courts with respect to North Carolina. Yeah, Maricopa County, what they did in Maricopa County had to do not so much with the redistricting, but it had to do with slashing the number of polling places. And that really, there was a real backlash there from voters of both parties, because in the Arizona presidential primary, which happened last spring, or spring of 2016, I should say, both Democratic primary voters going to vote for Bernie or Hillary, and Republican voters who were going to vote for Trump or Cruz or Rubio or whoever were really, really mad. And they were waiting in long, long lines, both parties, because they had severely slashed the number of polling places. They claimed it was for cost reasons, but there were insinuations of other reasons as well, and it really, really backfired because people were really up in arms about the waits and the long lines. I think that's it. All I will say is this. If any of you after this event, unfortunately I can't stay very long here, but I have a babysitter issue, and my wife is out of town for work, and so I've got someone staying with my kids. But if you ever have thoughts or ideas or feedback or pushback, my tender feelings will not be hurt, I promise. If you have an idea about something where we're falling short as a state or our office is falling short, I really do want to hear from you. My email is the same as most other state employees. It's just steve.simon@state.mn.us, same sort of protocol for most state employees, steve.simon@state.mn.us, or just call the office and ask to talk with me. And I'm happy to talk with you or arrange a time to talk with you or a group or anything like that, because many of you, particularly league members, I found, really do a lot of forward thinking and smart thinking about these issues, not only with the benefit experience, but looking ahead past just the next election. And so I value your input. I value your suggestions, even if it's constructive criticism. That's fine with me. I thank you for your time and attention, and thanks for the honor that I get to have of being your Secretary of State. Thank you.